In this course, you will learn how to develop a web application from scratch using popular technologies such as SQL Server for database, .NET Core Web API for backend development, and the latest Angular 10 for front-end web development. We will first start with installing and setting up the environment needed for development. Then start creating databases and objects needed for our app. Then develop API endpoints using .NET Core Web API. Finally, we will be using Angular 10 to design the front-end part of our app. You will learn how to create the navigation menu and tables using Bootstrap. Add routing to our Angular app. Add Modal pop-up windows with drop-downs and date pickers. And also add upload profile picture functionality and store it in our app. We will also learn how to add custom filtering and sorting features without using any third-party packages. I thank you for watching, welcome to the course and happy learning. Let's install SQL Server, which is needed to create databases and objects needed to store our app data. Just type install SQL Server and open the official download link. Download the developer version, which is free to download and use. Run the installable file. Choose Custom Install. Click on Installation and New SQL Server Standalone Installation. Let's choose Database Engine only for now and proceed with defaults. Choose Mixed Mode. Set the desired password. Also add the current user and make sure that the user is also admin. Now let's click on Install. Now let's install the SQL Server Management Studio, which is nothing but the user interface to work with databases. Just keep the defaults and install it. Now let's open SQL Management Studio and check if everything is fine. To open a local database, just type dot in the server name and click on Connect. We can see some default system databases. Let's write a simple select query on one of the existing tables. We have now successfully installed SQL Server and Management Studio. Now let's install Visual Studio, which we will be using to create the API project. Just type download Visual Studio and follow the official website. Let's download the community version, which is free to install. Run the installer file. We need ASP.NET Web Development. .NET Desktop Development. Let's also choose .NET Core Development. We have now installed Visual Studio. Now let's install Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a popular lightweight open-source code editor developed by Microsoft. We will be using it mainly to work with Angular project. Just type install Visual Studio Code and follow the official website. Download and install it with default settings. We have successfully installed Visual Studio Code. Now let's install Postman, which will be used to test the API methods. Just type install Postman and go to official link. Download and install it with default settings. You don't have to create an account. Just click on Skip. We have now successfully installed Postman. Now let's install Node.js, which we will be using to create and run the Angular project. Just type install Node.js and go to official link. Download and install it with default settings. You can open Node.js command prompt to check the version and verify the installation. We have now successfully installed Node.js. Hello everyone, in this video, let's learn how to install Angular CLI. Angular CLI is a command line utility which we will be using to create and run Angular projects. Although Angular can be installed only to a specific project, it is recommended to install it globally. Let's open Node.js command prompt. Type this command, npm install -g angular/cli. Angular CLI is now installed. Let's just verify the version of it. Just type ng -- version. We can see that we have installed version 10 of Angular. Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to create the database and the tables required for our application. Let's first open up SQL Server Management Studio. Let's connect to local database. To do that, just type dot in the server name and click on connect. We see that currently we don't have any user-created databases. Let's start creating the database and tables needed for our app. Just click on New Query to open up a query editor. To create a database, just type create space database space the database name. In our case, the name of our database is EmployeeDB. Once the query is written, just select it and click on Execute button. The database is now created. We can verify it by refreshing the databases. Now let's start creating the tables required for our app. Our app has mainly two screens, a department screen and an employee screen. So we need to create two tables. Let's start with department table. The table will an integer ID column with identity 1, 1, which basically means we don't have to pass values to this column. It will start with value 1 and increments it each time a new record is inserted. We will also add a column which stores department name. Let's execute this query. Let's write a select query on this table. We see that we don't have any records in this table yet. Let's insert one by writing an insert statement. We don't have to pass the value for department ID since it will be inserted automatically. After executing select query, we can see that a row is now available with ID equal to 1. Now let's add another department. We can see that the ID of new department is 2. Now let's start creating the employee table. We need employee ID column. Employee name column. The department to which the employee belongs to. The date of joining whose data type is a date. And finally, we will also store the uploaded profile photo name. The actual photo will be stored in the API app server. Let's write an insert query. and a select query. We have now successfully created the database and the required tables to build our application. Let's start creating the .NET Core Web API project. Open Visual Studio. Click on Create New Project. Let's choose ASP.NET Core Web Application. Let's rename it. Choose the preferred folder to save the project. Choose API. We don't need HTTPS configuration for now. Now let's take a look at some of the important project files. All the dependencies or the packages needed for our project can be found in the Dependencies folder. Launch Settings JSON file contains details of how the project should be started. Controllers folder is where we write all our API endpoint methods. We will create separate controller files here as per requirement. We generally keep our configuration values such as database details in appsettings.json. The program.cs contains the main program, which is the entry point of our project. Also, it creates web host, which basically helps the app to listen to HTTP requests. The startup class configures all the services needed for our app. Services are basically reusable components that can be used across our app using dependency injection. It also contains the configure method, which creates our app's request processing pipeline. We need to make a couple of changes in startup class. One is to enable the cores. By default, all web API projects come with a security which blocks requests coming from different domains. We are basically writing instructions now to disable that security and allow the requests to be served. We are also making one more change to the serializer class to keep the JSON serializer as our default. We might need to install a NuGet package to do this. Let's import the namespace. Now let's simply run our project and check if everything works fine. We see that the project works as expected and we are getting JSON result from one of the sample method. Now let's create the models needed for our app. Let's create a folder. Add a class file. Let's name it department.cs. Now let's add properties. Since department table has 2 columns, we will add 2 properties. Similarly, let's create the employee model. Now let's add our database connection in App Settings file. Now let's add a controller to add API methods for department table. To access the configuration from App Settings file, we need to make use of the dependency injection. Now let's add an API method to get all department details. I am writing raw queries to keep the tutorial simple. Please avoid following the same. You can use stored procedures with parameters or maybe even entity framework to connect to database. To work with database, we need to install a NuGet package called system.data.sql client. Let's define a variable to store the database connection string. Using the SQL connection and the SQL command, we will execute our query and fill the results into a data table. And then return the data table as JSON result. Let's test this method using Postman. The get method seems to be working. Now let's add the post method to insert data. We are writing an insert query to insert data. The post method seems to be working. Now let's add put method to update data. We will be using update query for this. Let's test the put method and update one of the department names. The put method works fine as expected. Let's finally implement the delete method. The delete API method will receive the ID of department as input. Since we are sending the ID in the URL, we need to add it in the root parameter. The delete method also works as expected. Let's add the API methods for employee screen. We can just reuse the methods written in department controller and make changes to it. Let's now test all our employee API methods. Let's now write an API to store the uploaded photos. Let's create a folder to store photos. To be able to use this folder in our app, we need to add some instructions in Startup class. Now let's create the API method. I am giving a custom root name for this method. We will simply extract the first file which is attached in the request body. We need to again use dependency injection to get the application path to folder. Let's save this file in our Photos folder. Once saved, we will simply return the file name. If there is any exception, we will simply return the default anonymous photo file name. We may also need a method to get all department names in the drop-down menu. Let's finish writing that as well. Let me give some basic introduction to Angular project that we are going to create. Let's take example of the app that we are going to build. It basically has two main screens. One to show departments data, and another one to show employees data. Also, we will be adding pop-up screens to add or edit the departments or employees. Traditionally, if we would like to build this just using HTML, CSS and JavaScript as a single-page application, we would have to write all the features in one HTML file. This would get complicated to maintain. With Angular, we can make use of something called as components, so that each component contains only the HTML needed for the specific feature. For example, for our app, we will create two main components: department component and employee component. Again, inside each of these components, we can add child components. One child component to show or delete records. Another child component to add or update records. And this is how the component folders actually looks in the project. This is how the architecture of our Angular project looks like. We have something called as shared service, whose main function is to send and receive data from the API. All the components that we are going to create will make use of this shared service file to send or receive data from API. Let's create the Angular project. I am creating a new folder called UI in which I will create the Angular project. Open command prompt in this path. Let's check the Angular version installed. We currently have Angular 10 installed. To create project, just type ng space new space the app name which I am giving as Angular 10. Let's keep the routing feature. We can also add it later in case we select no at this point. Let's keep default styling. Once the command is completed, a new folder with project name will be created with some files. Let's view them in Visual Studio Code. First, navigate inside the project folder, which in our case is called as Angular 10. Type code space dot. We can see all the files in this project in the left side pane. Before viewing them, let's simply run the project and see how the output looks like in the browser. Just type ng space serve space dash dash open. This command will serve our application in the default browser. We see that this Angular project already has some content. Let's see where it is coming from. Just open the source folder. Inside this we have a file named index.html. This is the final file which gets rendered from Angular project. Inside body, we have a custom HTML tag. We call them as selectors. This particular selector is inside app folder. Open appcomponent.ts. We can find the selector here. The corresponding HTML content behind this selector can be found in appcomponent.html. What you currently see on the screen is coming from this HTML file. Let's delete everything in this file and write hello world in h2 tag. After saving the files, the Angular CLI automatically reloads the view in browser. Now let's take a look at some of the important files. Package.json contains all the packages or modules or dependencies that are currently used or needed by this project to run. Angular.json contains configuration options for serving, testing and building this project. Index.html is the final file which gets rendered when running the app. App module contains an entry of all the modules, new components and services that we create in this Angular project. App component is the root component. We can add any number of child components. All of them will reside inside the app folder. App component HTML is the HTML content of root component. An app component.ts is the file which contains all the functionalities written in TypeScript or JavaScript language. These functionalities will be used by app component HTML. App component.css contains all the styling needed for app component HTML. If you need to add styling globally and not specifically to one component, we can add them inside styles.css. Let's create the components and services needed for our app. As already discussed previously, we need two main components. One for department and another for employee. Again, each of these components will have two child components. One to show or delete and another one to add or update. Also, we need one service file to consume the APIs. Let's create the components first. Just type ng space generate space component space the name of the component. We can see that the department component has been created in the app folder. Let's create the child components for department. One for showing the department data or deleting it. Another one to add new department or edit. Next, let's create the employee component. And the child components of employee component. Now let's create the service file. Just type ng space generate space service space the name of the service. If we just open app module, we can see that an entry has been made for all the components that we just created. We also need to add an entry for service file, else we may not be able to use it in other components. Just add the service name in providers section as well. Now we have successfully created all the components and services needed for our app. Let's complete adding the logic to consume all the API methods in shared service file. First, let's register the HTTP client module in app module. Also, let's import couple of other modules related to forms which we will be using in other components. Let's import the HTTP client module and observables module. Observables are basically used to handle asynchronous requests and responses. Let's add the API URL. Before that, let's run the API project to get the API URL. Let's add the API URL. Also, let's add the photo URL which we will be using to display profile pictures in our Angular app. Let's instantiate the HTTP client in constructor. Let's first add the method to consume the getDepartmentData API. Similarly, let's add method to consume the postDepartment API to add new department. Put department API to update the department details. And finally delete to delete a department. We will pass the ID and URL. Let's make a copy of all these methods to replicate for employee APIs. Let's also add the method to save profile pictures. Also, we have one more method to get all department names. We have now added all the methods to consume all the API we have in Out API project. Let's add routing to our app. Routing is basically the ability to navigate to a particular screen of an app by just using the URL. For example, if we type department in the URL, we should be able to navigate to department screen. And if we type employee, we should be able to navigate to employee screen. Currently, the department screen consists only this text, department works. Same with employee screen. To add routing, just open the app.routing.ts file. Import the employee and department components. Let's now add the roots in the roots array. If user types employee, we should show employee screen. If they type department, they should see department screen. Also add this selector in app component HTML. Now let's test the app. We have successfully added routing feature to our app. Let's add Bootstrap to our application. Bootstrap helps us to build and style our web pages much faster. There are basically two ways we can add Bootstrap. One is the traditional approach which you see on the screen. Bootstrap has also a version of it designed exclusively for Angular projects. To install that, we need to just run the command that you see on the screen. We are going with the traditional approach. First, copy the stylesheet link. Open index.html. And paste it in the head section. Next, copy the script tags and paste them just before the closing body tag. We have now added Bootstrap to our application. Let's add navigation menu to our application. Our navigation menu will basically have two options. One to navigate to department screen and another one to navigate to the employee screen. First, open the app component.html. Let's add a div with class container. Before adding navigation menu, let's add some heading to our application. I am using Bootstrap class names for styling purposes. Now let's add the navigation menu. Inside the list item, I am adding buttons which on click will activate the corresponding route which is mentioned in the router link attribute. Now let's test the navigation menu. We can see that we are able to navigate to corresponding screens based on selection in navigation menu. Let's create the table to show departments data in the department screen. Open showDepartment.ts file inside department component. Let's declare a variable to store department list and assign empty array as of now. We need to use the API method written in shared service file to fill the department list array. Let's import the shared service in our component. Also instantiate it in the constructor. Now let's write the method to refresh the department list variable from the API method. Subscribe method makes sure to wait till the response is received from API call and then only assign value to the department list variable. This is an asynchronous operation. Also, we need to call the refresh method in ngOnInit function. ngOnInit is the first method that gets executed when this component is in scope. Now let's add the table in HTML file. I am adding Bootstrap styling for table. We will have department ID column. Department name column. And also one more column called as options in which we will add feature to edit or delete the record. Now let's add the table body. ng for is one of the directives in Angular which can be used to replicate HTML elements based on array data. You can think of it just like a for loop. For example, if we have 2 records in the department list, we will have 2 TRs. The 2 curly braces you see is called as string interpolation. We generally write variable name inside this. It displays the corresponding values. Also, for time being, let's add 2 buttons to edit and delete records. We shall complete their functionalities later. We need to do one last thing. Just copy the selector from showDepartment.ts file and paste it in the parent department component HTML file. We can see that we have successfully populated the table with department data. Now let's add the Modal pop-up window which we are going to use to add new department or edit existing department. I am using the Modal design that we can see on this official Bootstrap website. Let's copy the code and paste it in the show department HTML. We need to make some changes to it. First, we need to call our custom method on button click so that we can activate our add edit department component. Let's change the name of our button. Make it float on the right side of the screen. The additional attributes data backdrop and data keyboard will make sure that user cannot click outside the Modal window to close it. Next, instead of the default title, we will set the title using a variable that we will populate in TypeScript file because we need to use same Modal window for both add and edit. Next, we will call custom function on close so that we can deactivate the add edit component. Let's get rid of the Modal footer. And inside the body, we need to copy and paste the selector of add edit department component. We need to pass department object to our add edit component so that it knows whether to add new department or edit existing department. And we are writing ngIf directive so that we activate the component only on click of add or edit button. Now let's complete the add click function. Inside it we will set the title, department object and variable for ngIf. Let's declare the 3 variables to be set. When adding new department, we set department ID to 0 to indicate the add-edit component that we are trying to add new department. Also set the modal title to add department. And set activate add edit department component to true. Now let's complete the close function. We just need to deactivate the add edit component. And refresh the department list so that in case new department is added, we can see it without refreshing the page. Let's finish the add and edit functionality for department screen. We need to copy attributes from add button to edit button as well so that we can activate the pop-up on edit button click as well. We need to pass the department item object which contains the details of the record to be edited. On click of edit button, we should send the department object details to add edit screen. Set the title to edit department. And also activate the add edit department component. Since we are passing department object as input to the component, we need to capture the same in the add edit component. So we need to make use of input directive. Also, when the add edit department component is activated, the ng-on-init function will be called inside which we will initialize the department ID and department name variables. Now let's add the controls needed for department add edit screen. We just need one text box to capture department name since department ID is non-editable. ng-modal is used for two-way data binding. For example, if we enter some text in this text box, the variable department name will be updated automatically with the text box text value. We need to create two buttons. One for add and one for update. Add button will be visible when department ID is equal to 0. An update button will be visible when department ID is not equal to 0. Now let's complete the add and update methods. We need to import the shared service file to call the add and update API methods. We need to create the department object in JSON format. Let's also instantiate the shared service. We just need to call the add department API method and pass the new department object. Update will be implemented in a similar way. Only difference is the department ID will not be 0. We need to make the modal window to align in center and also make it look bigger. Let's make some changes in the modal window class. Now let's test the add and edit functionality. We see that add and edit functionalities are working as expected. Now let's complete the feature to delete the department. But first, instead of these text buttons, let's use the Bootstrap icons. Just copy the code of required button design and paste it inside button tag. Now let's implement the delete function. We need to call the delete department API method and pass just the department ID. Once successful, let's display the message. Also refresh the table. Let's test by deleting one record. We see that the delete feature works as expected. Now let's complete the Show Employee Table screen. We just need to replicate the functionality of Show Department screen, and the minor difference would be to simply change the variable names to employee instead of department. Let's copy the Show Department HTML first. Just change the department variable names to employee. Also, the add edit component will now point to employee add edit component. And we will have column names of employee table. Now let's copy the TypeScript file. First, copy the import statements. Next, all code starting from constructor line. The employee object will have a photo file name. By default, if no profile picture is uploaded, we will show a default anonymous profile picture. Just change the API to employee methods. We need to add the selector in employee main component. Now let's test the show employee screen. We see that the show employee screen works. Let's complete the add and edit feature for employee screen and also upload profile picture functionality for employee screen. First, let's copy the TypeScript file content from add edit department screen and make changes to it accordingly. Let's declare the variables needed. Photo file path will be the final path of a photo that we use in the image tag to display it on the screen. Also, we have an option to select department name from dropdown. Let's declare an array to store the names and use it in the drop-down. In ng-on-init, we need to first populate the department names variable and then assign the other employee record data to variables. The photo URL path is declared in service file. We are going to make use of it to compute the final photo path. Let's complete the add and update methods for employee. Finally, we are going to write method to save the uploaded profile picture. We are going to create a form data and assign the file name and the file to it. And then send this form data to API method. Let's now complete the add edit employee HTML file. We need to show both employee details and profile picture in the screen. So let's give 60% of space to employee details. And 40% space for profile picture. The picture will also have a upload button below it so that users can upload new pictures. Now let's add the text box for employee name. Drop down to select department name. The values for drop-down will be loaded using the variable that we are populating in ng-on-init method. Also let's add date field to choose date of joining. Let's make changes to the add and update buttons as well. Now let's test the functionality. Let's add a new employee. Let's enter details. And upload a profile picture. We see that new employee is saved successfully. Now let's edit it. Let's change the name and try to save. Update also works as expected. Let's finally test delete. We see that all the functionality of employee screen works as expected. Let's add a custom sorting and filtering option to department table. Let's start with filtering. We will add a text box at the top of each column. Let's declare variables to capture user input to filter text boxes. Also let's add another variable which will have backup of department data. Now let's write the filter function which will apply the filter on backup data and assign it to the department list variable. We are making use of includes method which will check if a record contains the filter text input. Now let's add the text boxes to capture filter text. Let's test the feature. We see that the filtering feature works as expected. Now let's add sorting feature. We need to add 2 buttons for each column. The sorting method will accept 2 parameters. One is column name and another one is Boolean, which indicates whether to sort in ascending or not. We will have 2 buttons. One to sort in ascending and another to sort in descending. For buttons, let's use Bootstrap icons. Now let's complete the sorting method. We will apply the sort on backup data and assign it back to the department list variable. We will have separate logic for ascending and descending. Let's now test the feature. We see that the sorting works as expected.